A dark chapter of history is being written in Eastern Europe at the moment, and there's no doubt it'll be studied by historians in years to come. And one man who's dedicated his life to studying and learning from the past is Dr. David Starkey, the author of numerous books on the Tudors and regular commentator on current affairs. He's famed for not mincing his words, something which got him into quite a bit of hot water in 2020 when he made some comments about slavery. He had to resign as a visiting professor at the University of Cambridge, but has since gone on to start a successful YouTube channel, David Starkey Talks. Dr. David Starkey joins me in the studio now. Thank you so much for joining me.
A great pleasure.
So, David, let's talk about your passion for history. And when did that start? Why were you so passionate, and why are you so passionate about it?
Do you know what? Like most of the important... You were raising big questions in the intro. Most of the big things in my life are pure accident. And history was an accident, along with everything else. My best subject at school were the hard sciences, physics and chemistry. But I wasn't a particularly good mathematician. And so I had the good wit, as there were some very bright maths students in my class. They, like me, went on to Cambridge to study the sciences. I realised, I couldn't do sciences properly unless I was good at maths. So I looked for the art subject that had that edge of hardness, that had that edge of evidence, of debate, of clarity. And, of course, it's history. So that's the logic. I've always had a bit of sentiment, though. I'm not quite as tough and brutal as I occasionally appear. And right as a child, I was fascinated by old things. Not history, bits of old furniture, bits of pottery. We had an auction house. Auction house is a very grand word. It actually mainly... brought up in a council house in the Lake District, and it backed onto the field at the back of the auction mart where they sold cows and they sold sheep. And every so often they sold bits and pieces of old furniture and pot. And this is the 1940s and 50s, so it was all terribly old-fashioned. And it was thrown out. And I would used to go to the rubbish heap and pick out bits. So those scenes of children in India picking over piles, well, I did something a little bit like that as a boy, and that's the emotional side.
So that's how you sort of... And then you sort of followed it through, didn't you? So talk
my entire career. My entire career. Once I got to Cambridge, I mean, I became good at history at school. You've always got a break. There are individuals you can go through that give you things. And my history master, George Zare, at my local grammar school, long shut, was a terrible teacher lower down the school. He was awful. He was the very model of how you don't teach history. Note after note on the board, pure boredom of fact. But he did one really extraordinary thing for me at sixth form level. He gave me access to his own library. And that, he was a failed Don. He'd wanted to be a teacher at Cambridge. He hadn't made it. But he had a wonderful library in a beautiful room.
Oh, I love it. Did he have, books on the shelves? And he had
completely shelved. I can remember it. It was matted. There was a desk. There was an armchair. And he let me use it. And by the time I went to Cambridge as an undergraduate, I had read every damn book I needed to have done. That terrible word that got me into trouble. I read every damn book that I needed to have done. And the result was, again, a confession. I didn't do terribly well when I first went to Cambridge. I was bored. I had, again... We're talking about ups and downs. I had a terrible experience with my first supervisor. That's the person who handles your weekly essays, and I shan't name her, but she did the most stupid thing she could have done. At the end of our first supervision, and I've got a witness, I'm still friendly with the lad that I, no longer, now doddering old in his 70s like me, the student that I was with, she said to me, "You know more about this than I do. What do you say that to a bumptious, arrogant 19-year-old for?" Lethal. And it took me really until my third year when I engaged with somebody really serious, Geoffrey Elton, later on Sir Geoffrey Elton. And in those days, I think you still do, the special subject, you actually handle historical documents. And I discovered I could do it. And I suddenly got this excitement. And Starkey being Starkey, you will like this one, Nana. I actually corrected my teacher.
Oh, good, yes.
And there was that moment where you saw the look in the eyes. What am I going to do with it? With very deep voice, the kind of voice that leads to prostate problems, yes, you're right. And from then until, again, we had a most terrible quarrel much later in life, he was the key figure in shaping me.
I see. So you've really had an interesting journey, and I like what you said at the beginning, actually, because history is just a series of accidents, and then there are people who you come across that will sort of help to shape you, and some of those people that you mentioned. If you're, what do you think as you're watching now? Because a lot of people are comparing Vladimir Putin to Hitler. A lot of people are making that comparison and a sense of history repeating itself. What would you say to that, and is that something that you think is a fair comparison?
I think it's much more useful to compare Putin with the people that Putin compares himself to. He sees himself as a Russian Tsar. He sees himself as Peter the Great or Catherine the Great. Peter the Great conquers the half of the Ukraine that goes up to the Dnieper River on which Kiev sits. Catherine the Great conquers the other half, the western half, by Poland. And then the area down by the Black Sea is conquered by the great general Alexander Suvorov. And he, in that extraordinary historical ramble that he gave, he references all these. And do you know what? It's true. So I think our problem is that we've got such a narrow framework of historical reference ourselves. Putin is behaving in exactly the same way that virtually every European leader did until the First World War. Right. In other words, using power as an instrument, determined to advance what he sees as the interests of his country. He's a natural imperialist. But then what we all now have decided, oh, the age of empire's over. Well, the age of the British Empire is over. The age of the Russian Empire is, and the age of the Chinese Empire isn't. Empires are natural. They're part of the world experience. We've spent certainly the last 30 years, and particularly, I think, since the end of the Second World War, we've lived in a never-never land. We've lived in a fool's paradise. We thought that war wouldn't really happen and certainly wouldn't happen to us. We thought that you could murmur things about, a rules-based international order. There is an international court to punish war crimes. But, those things don't happen by magic. They need power. They need weapons. Isn't it stupid that we talk about arraigning Putin for his war crimes? So it's a little matter of, first, you defeat him. Secondly, you bring him down. Thirdly, you persuade the Russians to hand him over. Let me just, you making the comparison with Hitler. Yeah. Right. In 1942, we did actually begin the investigation of the possibility of war crimes by Hitler. In other words, it was planned. Why were we able to do that? Because in 1939, when war was declared and when Churchill took over as Prime Minister, do you know what the war aim was? No. Total surrender. Right. We daren't even fight a war. We daren't even impose a no-flight zone because Russia has nuclear weapons. Yeah. And we've got to learn to think, Nana. We need to start to think. We just spend our time in wish fulfillment. I mean, the silliest thing that I've seen, and in one sense I felt sorry for them and for their naivete, but it was one night last week, and I was going to talk in Westminster, and it was one of the nights of the tube strike, so traffic was moving very, very slowly. And we were going round Trafalgar Square. And you know the corner of Trafalgar Square where there's a ridiculous ice cream cone monument sitting on the plinth? All round that, there were hundreds of sweet young people in rucksacks, and you could hear them. No more war. No more war. Give peace a chance. What did they think they were doing? Who did they think was listening? Did they imagine Putin was blushing red to the roots of his hair, that he'd run in a state of complete shame? It's also heightened, isn't it, by the social media. People think if they say something on Twitter, they've done something. They think if they post, a nice blue and yellow flag, You're actually making a gesture for peace.
It's nothing, is it?
It's nothing.
It's pointless. But speaking of gestures, and I wanted to talk about this because Darren Grant has a show here on GB News, and I know this was a very sort of famous incident that occurred where on one of his podcasts you said slavery was not genocide, otherwise there wouldn't be so many damn blacks in Africa or in Britain, would there? An awful lot of them have survived. And I know as a result of that, you know, certain things happened and all sorts. What were you thinking when you said that? And what did you mean by it, actually?
Well, what I meant, first of all, it's one of these terrible things that happens that when you do a podcast, this is, remember, in lockdown, in the comfort of your home, with a glass of wine beside you.
Oh, dear.
And the tongue slips. Remember, that incident only became viral because it was deliberately clipped. It went onto YouTube. So if there is a vast problem, we should also really be debating this business of YouTube clipping.
Out of context is very...
out of context. There were two things wrong with the remark. Not the statement of fact. Slavery is not a genocide.
I would agree with that.
Slavery, and we'll just investigate that in a minute. The second thing was my tongue tripped twice. Maybe there was more than one glass of wine. And the statement should have said there wouldn't have been so many blacks in America, in other words, the United States, or in England. The reference to Africa is absurd, and when I actually read the transcript, I listened to it 3 times as I was incredulous that I'd said it. Let me explain what the statement means. The work on the transatlantic slave trade is now very well understood because we're talking about Hitler. Why do we know so much about the real genocide, the Holocaust? Because Hitler and Eichmann and the Germans generally were obsessively good at recording things. So they actually kept a track of everybody who was sent to the concentration camps. They produced the evidence of their own war crimes. Yeah. Similarly, the Spanish and the Portuguese, who control the bulk of the slave trade across the Atlantic, keep incredibly good records. And then later on, there are insurance records and all this sort of thing. And what the records show is this. From the 15th century to the 19th century, about 10 million blacks are exported from Africa to the New World. The vast bulk of them, it's really important we get this right, go to Brazil. Hugely the biggest slave trade. We never hear about it.
No, we never hear about it.
It's the Portuguese slave trade. About 300,000 only go to what we now call the United States, the 13 colonies, before independence. By the time you've got to independence, you've already got 500,000. Now, that's not a genocide. Genocide means slaughtering a population. Yeah. It's a hideous, monstrous crime. Nobody would ever dream of arguing about that.
But I would agree with you that slavery is...
You see, no. But let's just...
In this context, it's not genocide.
Right. Let me explain where there is a slavery genocide, which you've probably not heard about either. That is, there's at least the same number of slaves, of black slaves, that are sent across the Atlantic, are sent into the Islamic world overland. 10 million. Some people argue it's as high as 15. And barely a single person survives.
Right.
Why? Because the men are castrated. The mixed-race children, of course, fathered on the women by their Turkish masters, have their brains dashed out at birth. Yeah, that is a genuine genocide. But it's really important, I think, that we call things by their proper names. What happens with slavery, with the Atlantic slavery? I don't know whether you're, in ancestral terms, a product of it. It should be called the black diaspora. Right. In exactly the same way. In other words, if we're borrowing from Jewish history, genocide, the slave trade amounts to exactly the same equivalent, again carried out by force, as the dispersal of Jews from Israel when it's conquered by the Emperor Titus. That's why Jews are scattered throughout Europe. It's why they don't have their own homeland, because of the forced exportation by the Romans. And exactly the same thing happens with a very similar process of deracination, of cutting people off from their cultural roots, cutting them off from their own languages. So rather than talking about genocide, we should be focusing on what the real problem is. But a final point, Britain was heavily involved for 1 century, but Britain made amends. Britain actually abolished it.
Well, that's right, and we were the first to do that. Now, David, because we're running out of time...
I'm sorry, I talk too much.
No, you don't.
My problem is...
You didn't ask the question, but I want to ask you very briefly then, so, because we've got about a minute left, so what are you up to now?
Oh, I'm launching my own YouTube channel. I always, as we were talking about, my talking too much. I enjoy talking.
I know.
And YouTube is a wonderful means of doing it. I don't want to be pompous, but I feel a real sense of the need to do it. Taking the discussion back right to the beginning, I think we've misunderstood our history. I think we've got it wrong, and I think in Britain this is particularly dangerous. We are a country whose constitution depends on its history, on understanding its history correctly. Because we understand it so badly, we're at terrible risk of going wrong.